Hello, everybody. My name is Lat Mackey, and this is Sequence Break IL, a look at speedrunning, game development, content creation, and everything in between. Thanks so much for being here. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Thanks for liking and all that fun jazz. In this one, gonna talk about Dark Souls, and specifically an interview I did with catalystz back in 2021 for the Games Done Quick show. And if you're not familiar with Kata, then you probably aren't too familiar with Dark Souls speedruns. The entire series, not just Dark Souls, but a lot of the Soulsborne games. Kata is just kind of a legend in the speedrunning Dark Soulsborne community. And I gotta tell you, Dark Souls, this series is a series that I still to this day have not played through myself. And so when I went about starting this topic, the place where I started from was the Dark Souls games have always been some of the most popular games that have been watched. If you just went by like viewing numbers and hours and things like that at Games Done Quick, millions and millions of people have viewed them on their YouTube channel. But then if you look at the leaderboard, so many of those runs have just been extremely popular with the community. And I got to be honest, I had a little hesitation when I first wanted to take on this. One, because I know basically nothing about it other than I really enjoy watching the speedruns of it. And then number two, I had some kind of negative experiences with people playing Dark Souls. And what I mean by that is, I'll just be honest with you. I was working for Mitch at the time. I was doing some video editing, and he was doing, I think he did blind playthroughs of Dark Souls. Did he do the whole series? He was doing blind playthroughs of Dark Souls, and people who weren't normal viewers of Mitch's channel would come into the chat, and how do I describe this? It almost felt like they were calling Mitch out for trying to learn and play the game. And admittedly, this probably only was like a handful of people, maybe 4 or 5 people. But it's so interesting how quickly that can kind of soil your experience for that community, that game, that whole thing. And I'm glad that I didn't let that deter me from moving forward with it, because what I have found out is that there is an awesome community around Dark Souls. And yes, there are those individuals who may have strong opinions and are passionate about certain aspects of the game and of the speedrun. That being said, there is so much happening in the community all the time, with people breaking new barriers, sharing strats, rooting each other on. And there's a lot more to it than just those few people that I had perhaps seen and interacted with during a playthrough of one of these. And it led me down like, what is the thing about Dark Souls that keeps people coming back and coming back? And for somebody who's never played it and still hasn't played at this point, although I do have some plans, I think I might actually start with Elden Ring at this point, because folks who don't, who have mentioned, hey, if you've never played a Dark Souls game, you may want to start with Elden Ring. It's got that kind of feel that gets you hooked in. But one of the things I've learned about Dark Souls and the series in general is that it's one of those games where there is a lot to it that keeps you hooked, and that keeps you the more that you spend time with the game, the more you get out of the game. And that's something that I took away from my conversation with Kata. But then also one of the things that I've noticed after watching a ton of great content, I was doing some research for just reviewing and remembering what I had gone through to research for the interview with Kata. Kata's got some great stuff on his YouTube channel, catalystz, and I'll link to it in the description or in the show notes, because if you're at all interested in this stuff, he's done some really great breakdowns on the speedruns themselves, the world record progressions, and all these different milestones, and obviously tutorials and all that kind of stuff. I mean, he's got just content coming out the wazoo for Dark Souls stuff. And if you're at all interested, it's really well done, really well produced. And more importantly, you're talking to somebody who has been and continues to be one of the best in the world at this game all the time. So we talk about some of it for the full interview from Games Done Quick. But like I said, I am not an experienced runner with this. I was just trying to absorb all the things that he was telling me. And part of me actually wants to go, talk with him again just to see what I would think about a couple years later, now that I know a little bit more. But to be honest with you, I think rewatching these clips and what I'm going to share with you here in just a moment, it actually has kind of inspired me. I think this is one of those games I'm putting on the list for 2023. And like I mentioned, I think it's going to be Elden Ring instead of Dark Souls. But At very least, I think I got to give it a try before I talk to somebody again about Dark Souls. I also want to give a little shout out to Tomato Anus, whose video I watched as well, to refresh my memory and to help me out with some of the things about this game. And I hope you enjoy it, because it's not something, especially for those of us like in the 8 and 16-bit, era of speedrunning. It's these Dark Souls is not a game that I grew up with. So trying to find it later on in life, I got to be honest, I'm glad I'm going to be taking it on now, because I'm such a better gamer than I was back when this game first came out. So I'm interested and excited to try it out. But more importantly, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Kata, because first of all, he's awesome. And secondly, his passion and his excitement and his enthusiasm for the game, even after all this time he has spent with the entire series, is absolutely infectious. And you're going to learn something, I promise. It might even inspire you to go take on a speedrun of this when you're done. So here, an interview with catalystz. Enjoy. What is it about this game? What makes Dark Souls this notorious, big time challenging game?
Well, I think for most people, it really doesn't need any introductions, right? It kind of, when it got released in 2011, it sort of brought back, at least in my point of view, it sort of brought back elements of gaming that were kind of forgotten for many years. Because games used to be pretty difficult back in the days when, there was just not enough storage and the developers needed to kind of span out the playtime, so they made the games really difficult, so people had to play them for longer. And I think Dark Souls sort of brought this tradition back, where all of a sudden the game's got a very hands-off approach. It's not leading the player. All of a sudden the player's expected to try and fail many times and learn from those mistakes. And just by playing the game more and more, eventually figuring out a way through. And I think this is sort of what really threw people off when the game got released. And now more and more games over the past decade has kind of picked up on this approach as well, where they're not being as hands-on, and they realize that perhaps the player should be treated with a little bit more respect and should be expected to be a little bit more intelligent rather. And given more freedom in regards to their decisions and in regards to learning how to kind of navigate through the world and figuring out how to defeat the challenges that lie ahead of them. I think that's kind of the gist, the core of what makes Dark Souls very special, and what a lot of games since then have tried to kind of re-imitate.
I am curious, what's kind of your first experience? Did you get what was your first casual playthrough, your first playthrough of this game? What's your history with Dark Souls?
So this is a funny topic, honestly, because this gets brought up quite often on my stream, and I am very much a big exception to the rule, let's say, right? Because most of the speedrunners that you will talk to that speedrun Dark Souls pick it up essentially as something that they really, really like, and they want to get more time out of it, right? And speedrunning and challenge running and other sorts of content or other sorts of playthroughs can be a great way to sort of get extra time out of the game. I'm very much different in that regard, because my first playthrough, I think it was in 2013 or something. So it was a little bit after the game came out, and it already gathered its reputation sort of. So I had heard about Dark Souls at that point, and that it was difficult and whatever. So I was like, yeah, I'll give it a shot, right? Why not? And I think I played it for maybe 10, 12 hours, and then I just got frustrated and I quit in Anolondo, funnily enough. And I basically didn't come back to the game until I started to learn the speedrun 4 years later. So that's kind of how my first playthrough of Dark Souls went. So definitely not the brightest moment in my gaming history. And I've always been very competitive and whatnot, right? So it is pretty rare for me to just give up on something. But yeah, somehow I kind of forgot about Dark Souls at that point, and it didn't really come back to me all the way until 2016, I think, when I played some Dark Souls 3. So that was actually the first Souls game I ever finished. And I can basically say that to this day, I have never finished a casual Dark Souls playthrough, of Dark Souls 1, that is. So yeah, that's sort of how I came to the game, casually.
Tell us a little bit about your early on trials and tribulations with this game. What was it like learning the speedrun, and what are some of the things that are particularly challenging when you're trying to learn this speedrun?
Right, so 2016 was actually when I finished Dark Souls 3. I only picked this up in late 2017, so it's gonna be I'm gonna be coming up on about 4 years now.
Yeah.
speedrunning the game. And essentially, when I began, obviously the biggest challenge was the fact that I didn't know like 80% of the game because I never finished it, right? So I was just learning the speedrun and I had no idea. Like I have this funny story. So there's the Four Kings boss fight in the game, and in the speedrun, or at least when I was learning it, and even nowadays, you enter it from out of bounds, right? The out of bounds itself is easy, so that was no problem learning. But then you're supposed to fall into the arena from out of bounds. However, there's a gimmick where you're supposed to wear a ring that protects you from the darkness that surrounds the arena, or rather, that is the arena, right? And that is just casual knowledge. And I kept on jumping into the arena from out of bounds, and I kept on dying all the time. And I couldn't, for the love of God, like I couldn't figure out why I kept on dying. What was I doing wrong? Am I dropping in the wrong place? Am I like completely missing the arena? Like what's happening? And it took me like an hour to figure out that, oh, I'm supposed to equip this ring that is like supposed to protect me. And this is the kind of casual knowledge that I was completely missing, right, at that time. So that was definitely a challenge. And B, I started with a route that was like very outdated by that time, by late 2017, because I went to our Speed Souls wiki. I say our now, because, you know, I've been part of the community for a while, worked on the wiki as well. But essentially, it is a perfect place to kind of get started with the speedrun and learn some of the strategies and routes. But at that time, the getting started section was kind of outdated. And it essentially recommended, or it gave an example of a route that doesn't farm random weapons. Because, you know, a lot of the fastest routes will require you to basically try your luck at a drop, because the weapon is very good. And if it doesn't drop, you have to reset and try again. So obviously for a beginner, that's not very optimal. And it basically said that you should try, like, for example, this Crapple Mage route. That's the name of it. And it was essentially sorcery only. And so I was like, okay, I'll just start with that because the wiki says so, right? And the contemporary route at that time in 2017 was like a lot better, utilizing the Dragon Tooth that I'm also utilizing in this run that's on the background. So that was another big challenge, is that I not only did I start with like no casual knowledge, I started with a really outdated run with a world record from like early 2016 that I was learning from. And I'm also the kind of guy that, you know, I try to just always figure out things first for myself before I have any questions. So I just kind of didn't really ask anyone, and I just kept on doing my thing. So that was a little bit challenging. But I must say that after like 2.5 months, I actually cracked top 5 with that outdated route. So
oh my gosh,
that was pretty cool to see. Though I must also point out that at that point, the leaderboards were kind of inactive. But still, top 5 was like, I was still pretty happy about that. And then I was able to transition into something else. But yeah, a lot of just experimentation and a lot of patience while practicing, right? And that is sort of what you need to have for Dark Souls, is the fact that you need to expect that not everything will be served to you on a silver platter, because there's just so many things about the run. It's just impossible for one runner or for a group of runners to transfer that knowledge to you immediately. It takes some time to kind of amass it, and so you need to expect to just, you know, have to repeat the bosses again and again until you sort of get the knowledge to be able to beat them somewhat consistently. And once you do, you will do runs, and then you will get never before seen things happen in the boss fight anyway, and still reset and die. And just, yeah, lots of patience is what you need, I think, to learn like any speedrun well, right? But Dark Souls even more so, I would say. There's a bunch of categories that we call major and minor, or you can say traditional and non-traditional. Essentially, the 4 main categories are 3 any percent categories and the all bosses category, which is being performed on the stream right now. And then there's like a bunch of other categories, like all achievements, for example, which basically collects all the trophies. But those runs are just not as big of a staple. They're not as popular, essentially. They're more niche. And this goes back to the variety that I was talking about. Like, there are so many different things that you can do in this game that these categories exist because they changed the game enough. They changed the playstyle enough to, you know, warrant these categories existing. Because I don't think it would make any sense to have like a bunch of categories where you basically do the same thing, except there's like one difference. But these different categories really completely change how you approach the game, how you route it, the glitches that you use, the skips that you are able to use. And I think that is really cool. And one last thing about the categories. The major categories are any percent of wrong warp, any percent force quit, and the all bosses. All bosses, I think that's self-explanatory. You need to slay all the 26 bosses that are in the game, including the DLC. Sometimes that gets asked, but of course DLC has bosses, so you need to kill those too. And the difference between the three any percent categories is essentially there's a glitch called force quit wrong warp that allows you to get to the final area of the game very early. And that was discovered like a month or a month and a half after the game came out. So when people started to run it, it got obviously separated from the other category where this glitch was banned, right? And given how this game always gets or has something new to offer, many years later in 2017, there was another way of wrong warping discovered, actually, which doesn't require you to force quit out of the game, right? Which can be a very kind of shady practice that... in particular with DS1, essentially, if we allowed using Alt F4 or force quitting in every single category, there could be shenanigans with the in-game timer. There could be shenanigans where you could essentially like force close the game after you made a mistake, and then it warps you back slightly, so you undid that mistake, essentially not really having a single segmented run anymore. So the force quitting was allowed only in one specific category, while in all others it was banned. And then when the different wrong warp was discovered, which is done completely within the game, there was another split being warranted, because it just, again, it changed the category, the any percent category, so much that people wanted to preserve, you know, the casual requirement of killing the four main lords and not completely like throw it down the drain and delete the entire history. So that's why there are three any percent categories and the all bosses category right now. And I think besides force quit, like all of them are fairly active. The detriment of force quit is that it's just so short, right? It's like around 20 minutes. So it is very much an RNG grind. And the other ones are all very, very active. So that's kind of how we have the game set up leaderboards wise.
Yeah, I think that's really cool. And I think that's, you mentioned it, and I think this is important to highlight, that there is, if you're at all interested in starting or even trying a speedrun of this game, there's something that could be approachable for you. And I really appreciate the fact, and I'm glad that I kind of know this now, that, you know, you can start on whatever you have access to. You know, that's one of the great things I think about speedrunning, is that, especially when you're starting, use what you have. You know, you don't have to go out and purchase a high-end PC to run this game at the highest level or anything like that. You should use what you have available for you. And I think that, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that's a really important aspect, especially if you want to join the community and you want to be a part of it. I think that's a really cool way to do so. This still, to this day, is one of the most deep and sophisticated and interesting speedruns that exists. And I'm glad you got a chance to share it with us. So thank you so much, Catalystz. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, same. Thanks for having me.
Thanks everyone for listening and watching. If you're enjoying the podcast, please feel free, subscribe, like, leave a comment, all that stuff people say at the end of a video. It honestly all goes a long way to help the podcast. Thank you so much. If you want to join us on Discord, we chat mostly about food, but occasionally we do talk about the stuff that's in the podcast. The link is in the show notes or in the description. Feel free. Come on by, join us. If you want to follow on Twitter, Sequence Break PC. Sequence Break PC. I post when I go live. It's kind of not at a set time, so if you want to see the live feed of the podcast, feel free, follow there. And finally, if you want to email, podcast@sequencebreakpodcast.com. Sequencebreakpodcast.com is also where you can find the backlog of all of the episodes. It's also on YouTube as well, so feel free, join in, have some fun. Thank you so much. I will see ya in the next one.